So, like Song said, there, memes don't function just in the way that genes do. It's very complicated because, there are more pressures so that affect the selection than simply the pressure to pass on to the next generation. And especially because, people and culture come into play. And so we, um, after observing different memes happening over the internet, I started to notice that, I'm a graphic design major, and I'm particularly interested in art history. So I started to notice parallels between the way that I started to notice parallels between the way that memes interacted with each other and progressed through time, which, were reminiscent of the way art, passed through history. So one of the main ideas is that, art can be divided into eras based on style and other factors. So, well, of course, style, the way that messages are conveyed, what values are, described in the art, and how that art is selected for by curators and clients and, the general public too. So, this is just a basic timeline of art since the beginning. And another thing is that not only do our art movements, not only can we clump art, generally into movements, we can also study those movements in relation to each other, where with each successive movement being a reaction to the previous one, and, also more to all of the ones that are in the past. It's also a quotation, a criticism, and expansion of the previous ideas, styles, and techniques. And so this is definitely something that we can see in memes, as I will show you. So you can basically divide art history into four distinct eras. So the first one would be pre-modernism. Well, we're not really going to talk too much about ancient art because it's not super relevant to contemporary art in terms of, well, contemporary art sometimes references ancient art, but the further away you go, the less, ancient art didn't have anyone to reference. So there's not much to talk about in terms of interaction with it. So with pre-modernism, we're mostly going to be talking about, the time period around the Renaissance. And so what we can see is, at this point in time, we are developing a style, and what was valued in art at the time was that it followed particular conventions, and those were generally very rigid, in that the art would have to, in order to be accepted, it was, first of all, most of the art was commissioned by clients. So it wasn't about the artist's individual freedom in expressing things. It was more about, it was geared towards a purpose. And therefore, all of the ideas present in the art were geared towards specific purposes. And therefore, the art had to be aesthetically pleasing and impressive, which was usually accomplished through technical prowess. So in this painting, we can see that the use of linear perspective and naturalistic figures showing the artist's prowess. And pre-modernism is interesting because, with because it's so different from modernism. And we'll see how modernism reacted to it. So modernism was a rebellion against tradition. And it was largely inspired by both, by different structural changes happening in the world at that time, which were the Industrial Revolution, Enlightenment, French Revolution. And so those three revolutions in thought and in the way that, in terms of Industrial Revolution, not only did it change technology, but it also changed the way that geographic boundaries and the way that cities were organized, because cities began to grow with the Industrial Revolution. So with modernism, we had an emphasis not on technical prowess, but on innovation and progress, on creating new ideas. So here we see there was a lot of manifestos happening in the modernist period, with people creating, whereas in pre-modernism, because of the client, everything was geared towards, the purpose of the art was usually either towards government or religion. And so in general, the philosophical attitude towards art was to achieve a kind of, the sublime, and, which was largely motivated by religious ideas. But with modernism, there was, the death of God, as Nietzsche said. So instead of receiving, the sublime from the past, the general ideology was to create your own ideology. And so with modernism, people experimented with new styles, and it was all about self-expression and creating, using art in ways that was never before seen. So with modernism, it was all about creating new things and progressing. But as we see with postmodernism, that changed. With postmodernism, it was more of a reaction. So obviously modernism was a reaction to the previous traditions, whereas postmodernism was also a reaction to modernism. And postmodernism is very different from modernism, because the dominant artistic styles, rather than creating new things, postmodernism relied on remixing, reinterpreting, and recontextualizing ancient and modern and other mediums in art. So because of that, part of it was because with postmodernism, there was a sense that everything had already been explored in terms of new things. So what postmodernism did was explore the old by contrasting it and by remixing it and so one of the things that grew out of it was conceptual art. For example, this piece right here by Joseph Kosuth is called One and Three Chairs, and it examines the form of the chair. So we have a picture of a chair, we have an actual chair, and then we have a description of a chair. And so in conceptual art, the execution of the piece is not as important as the actual idea that's in the piece. So it's the object of the object of value in the art is actually the idea, and not necessarily just the actual physical execution of it. With postmodernism, there was also a shift in general attitude, whereas with modernism, it was all about progress, individualism, reason, and things like that. Postmodernism was about cynicism, about questioning things, about deconstruction. And of course, that's not to say that there was an absolute lack of those things in modernism. Obviously, it's not like they are exclusionary, but in here it was more of an emphasis on this. And so next, we're moving to a kind of So with modernism, postmodernism, and premodernism, those are pretty well accepted, eras of art. And a lot of people still consider us to be living in postmodern times. But there have been recent developments in theory about where to go next from postmodernism. And with that comes the idea of metamodernism, which is a reaction to postmodernism. Since in postmodernism was all about remix, about cynicism, metamodernism is, on the other hand, while it's not exactly we can't really consider it as an era quite yet. It's more of a structure of feeling where it's all about creating art with new sincerity and taking things seriously. Whereas the cynicism of postmodernism was always about being irreverent and not quite taking things seriously and being playful with concepts and with everything in general. And so with metamodernism, there's a renewed desire for a sense of depth. But that doesn't come in the same way that there was a desire for newness and for seriousness with modernism. Because with metamodernism, there's a constant oscillation between the ideas, between cynicism and between sincerity. So with metamodernism, it's all about this kind of, bouncing between those two ideas and between a lot of other ideas too. So, whenever the pendulum, there's an often used analogy of a pendulum. When it swings too far into sincerity, that it becomes about fanaticism. The pendulum swings back to cynicism and to criticism, and vice versa. So basically, we can think of the four eras of premodernism, modernism, postmodernism, and metamodernism. As with premodernism, religion was one of the dominant, ideologies in terms of culture. And so modernist art was about, understanding, it was about trying to construct it was about trying to reach this kind of sublime that was considered, greater than people. Whereas, sorry, I meant premodernism, right? Okay. With modernism, on the other hand, people constructed their own idea of what the truth and that greatness was. And so they started building towards that. With postmodernism, we started questioning about what that truth was and whether it was possible to know such a truth. And with metamodernism, we come to the realization that regardless of whether it's not entirely true, there's still a value in having some kind of sincerity. And so basically, it's an interesting progression because we start with what we have, and preserving what we have. Then we go to building new ideas, new ways of thinking, new styles, exploring new things. Then we come to questioning them, breaking them down. And then finally, once we've broken them down too far, we begin to rebuild them in a way that is informed by the previous building and breaking. So with that, we come to the idea of the role of the internet in culture.